Moondyne Joe. One cold, misty night, a dark figure crept through the cobbled lanes of a Welsh village. A policeman patrolling the dimly lit streets became suspicious of a bulging sack slung over the man's shoulder and demanded to see what was inside. Out spilled cheese, bread, bacon, and a whole shoulder of mutton. Several days' food for a hungry young miner with no work. Joseph Johns was charged with stealing and sentenced to be transported to the British colony of Western Australia, where prisoners were sent as labourers. After waiting 4 years in a crowded English jail, he was herded aboard a convict ship and began the long voyage around the world. As the ship at last reached the land, convicts were allowed on deck, and Joe had his first glimpse of the bleak, windswept shores of his new home. His attention was drawn to the distant hills that lined the horizon of the Swan River settlement. Maybe someday, he thought, that's where I'll find freedom. Joe's good conduct during the voyage had earned him a ticket of leave, and he took work at convict depots scattered throughout the colony. He sweated under the blazing sun, splitting rocks and clearing roads. He was a strong, hard-working fellow who broke no rules and asked no favours. After 2 years, his good record was rewarded with a conditional pardon, his passport to freedom, and Joe headed for the hills. Joe became an expert bushman, exploring the wooded valleys and winding creeks. At Moondyne Hills, in a cave hidden among granite boulders, he slept on a bed of powder bank, stripped from the Wandoo forest. He showered under icy cold waterfalls that splashed over the rocks. When his clothes became ragged and torn, he made himself a kangaroo skin cape and possum skin slippers. Joe loved his new life. His cheerful bearded face and skills in the bush soon became known to the elderly settlers, who named him Moondyne Joe. It was said he knew every inch of country, every creek, hill and valley. On his travels, Joe would often stop and yarn with farmers who offered rewards for finding stock that had strayed. He constructed post and rail fences around the freshwater springs he had discovered in the hills, and captured lost stock and wild brumbies that came to drink. But not everyone trusted the convict bushman. When a valuable stallion mysteriously disappeared, the owner suspected Joe. "Look for my horse in the convict's trap," he told the police. Mounted troopers galloped to Moondyne Hills and found the missing stallion. "The horse is astray," Joe argued, but the troopers were not persuaded and escorted him to the local lockup. That night, Joe stared through the bars of a damp prison cell. The moon peeked through the clouds. "They'll not take my freedom away," he thought as he ate his supper. While the warders dozed, he scratched the soft stone around the lock with his knife and fork until the cell door sprang open. Silently, he crept through the dark courtyard. It wasn't long before the cry went up. "The bushranger is bolted!" "Capture the scoundrel!" growled the magistrate. "Hunt him down!" Joe coolly hid among the bales of hay in the loft of the prison stables. He smirked as he watched the troopers mount their horses and gallop off into the night. Then, when it was safe, he borrowed the magistrate's saddle and shiny new bridle and made a swift getaway on a thoroughbred left behind in the stables. Joe made a familiar bush inn at Mahogany Creek. There he mingled with the usual customers: merchants, stockmen, highwaymen, sawyers and teamsters. His mates, Five-Day Jack and 2-Foot Jimmy, were still laughing at Joe's tale of the escape when troopers burst through the door. "Hands up, Joe! We have you surrounded!" The bushranger dashed upstairs, wriggled through an attic window, slid down the roof onto a horse and galloped away. But the troopers gave chase, and within days he was recaptured. Joe served 3 years in the notorious prison at Fremantle before he was free to return to the steep hills and wooded valleys that he called home. Yet, not long after his release, Joe was in trouble again. This time he was blamed for the disappearance of a farmer's prize ox. Joe protested his innocence, but the judge was not amused. "It seems you have not learned your lesson," he told Joe. "I sentence you to 10 years with hard labour." Turning to the warder, he added, "And place the wretch in leg irons so he can't escape." Joe was put to work on a chain gang, but it wasn't long before he slipped out of his iron shackles. The shrill call of the bugle raised the alarm, but Joe seems to have vanished. Troopers scoured the forest tracks, warning the settlers, Moondyne Joe is on the prowl. Lock up your homesteads. But the settlers didn't fear Joe. Indeed, they had begun to admire him for his daring deeds. Some farmers hid Joe in their cellars. Others took food to his hideouts. Swagmen were proud to boil a billy with the old bushranger. Eventually, Joe became weary from the days on the run. Troopers found him curled up beside the embers of a campfire. Moondyne Joe was escorted back to prison, bound in leg irons. Soon, Joe was up to his old tricks. In the dead of night, he loosened the bars of his cell window and crept through the shadows of the prison yard. He scaled the high prison wall and lowered himself down the other side with a cord of knotted bed sheets. The alarm sounded, but Moondyne Joe was gone. People far and wide laughed as the bandit bushranger led the authorities a merry dance. Children teased the governor, making up new words to a familiar tune. The governor's son's got the pip, the governor's got the measles, for Moondyne Joe has given them the slip. Pop goes the weasel. Storm clouds gathered as Joe struck off his chains at a blacksmith's forge, and then scurried back to his hideout in the hills. Rain poured, creeks flooded, bridges washed away, but still the troopers pressed on in pursuit. To hide his tracks, Joe had made stilts from fallen branches and crossed the turbulent Avon River. But he could not outrun the troopers' horses. Before long, he was surrounded and shots rang out. "Give yourself up, bushranger," the troopers shouted. Joe faced his captors. The smell of gunpowder hung in the air. "I'll give you fair warning," he said with a fierce scowl. "I won't be staying in your miserable gaol for long." Back in the yard of Fremantle prison, Moondyne Joe was chained by the neck as an example to other prisoners of what to expect if they dared to escape. He was given starvation rations of bread and water, and then locked in a specially constructed escape-proof cell, its thick timber lining pegged with iron spikes. An extra steel plate was placed over the barred window. Little light or air penetrated. Outside, the sky was blue, but inside the cell, it was as dark as midnight. The governor was pleased. "This should dampen your restless spirit," he sneered. "If you can escape from here, you can have your freedom." His promise echoed through the cold prison corridors. Joe barely survived in the torturous cell. The prison doctor warned, if Moondyne Joe doesn't have fresh air and exercise, he might die. "Oh, very well then," the governor grumbled. "Put the rascal to work splitting rocks." The governor ordered rocks to be brought inside the prison, and every day Joe was led from his cell and put to work splitting lumps of limestone. As he swung the heavy hammer, he dreamed of freedom. Weeks passed, the heap of stone grew higher and higher, and Joe saw his chance. With most of his body hidden behind the rock pile, the guards could only see his arms swinging the hammer. Out of sight, Joe began to smash a hole through the prison wall. When the hole was big enough, he popped his hat and shirt on the hammerhead, then removed his trousers and arranged them on the rocks to make a dummy figure. Joe wriggled through the hole and escaped wearing only his flannel underwear and boots. By the time the guards realised they'd been tricked and the signal cannon boomed the alarm, Moondyne Joe was gone. He had done it again. The governor nearly choked on his dinner when he received news of the escape. "Offer a reward for the capture of that scoundrel," he spluttered, "dead or alive." Troopers searched far and wide, but Joe had vanished into the wild country he knew so well. What had become of him? People wondered. Where is he gone? Joe remained free for 2 years and might have kept his freedom if not for his fondness for a drop of wine. One night, some troopers stopped at a vineyard on their way back from investigating a crime. They were cold and wet, and the owner invited them to his cellar for a warming drink. As the door creaked open, a wild figure sprang out of the darkness. The astonished troopers wrestled the intruder. The flame of their candle flickered as they peered at their captive. "It's Moondyne Joe!" they gasped. Joe was escorted back to prison. By now a new governor was in command. "The old gov promised me freedom if I could escape. Will you not honour this word?" Joe asked defiantly. The governor carefully considered Joe's request. For many years your daring deeds have embarrassed the authorities, he said. But it is true. A promise was made. Agree to stay out of trouble, and I will set you free. The prison gate swung open, and Moondyne Joe was free at last. He boarded a ship and travelled south along the windswept coast to a new home, where winding creeks flowed beneath the forest trees, and where occasionally a settler's horse would go missing. The bushman's fugitive days were over, but the legend of Moondyne Joe had just begun.